One thing that I've talked about in depth throughout this entire YouTube journey of mine is that I also run a podcast on the side. And it was such a difficult process having to learn how to create a podcast from scratch. And I noticed that a lot of the reference materials that were online were mostly for podcasters that were based in other countries. I didn't find any Filipino podcasters who I could use to as a reference or as a guide to help me in my journey. So that's why I'm making this video now. As I talked about earlier, I have a book review and explainer podcast. It's called Fiction Friends. I've always loved reading books and I wanted to channel my passion for literature into a creative outlet. I've been a writer all of my life, and so I didn't just want to start another blog. I wanted to challenge myself creatively, and I thought that a podcast was the best way to do that. Throughout my short run as a podcaster so far, I've managed to grow our podcast to the point wherein we have somewhat of a fan base. We've charted multiple times on Apple Podcasts, and we've even caught the attention of major media outlets as well. And in this video, we are briefly going to go over all of the steps that you need to take to start a podcast in the Philippines. The first step to starting your podcast is to know your why. I know that this is such a cliche, and I have to admit I'm not the biggest Simon Sinek fan, but there really is value in knowing your why. Knowing why you want to start a project will ultimately help you in your decision making down the line. Whenever you're faced with crossroads about the direction of your podcasts, reminding yourself of what your why is will help you come to a decision. The next step is to determine what you want to talk about. Remember that you don't necessarily have to be knowledgeable about a topic in order for you to want to talk about it. It just has to be something that you're genuinely interested in, and your passion will help make your show more entertaining. In my case, I talk a lot about books because books are my passion. Literature is something that I've always been passionate about. You can also talk about niche topics like finance, entrepreneurship, pop culture, sports, true crime, or whatever. I'd also like to plug my fiance is actually launching her podcast, and there are going to be video formats for the podcast as well. It's called Ready to Talk Podcast. Please find it here on YouTube. I'll link them in the description box below. I plugged you, huh? And the next step is you have to do your research about other podcasts within your niche. Listen to what other podcasters are saying about the topic that you're interested in. Try to study their shows and figure out what you like, what you don't like. And the most important thing is think of how you can differentiate yourself from your competition. If you're just going to end up saying what everyone else is saying, then what makes you different from other podcasters out there? What will convince your listeners to listen to you instead? The next step is you have to choose your show format. There are ultimately two types of podcast formats, scripted and unscripted. And you can be successful at either one of them. Most popular formats are interview type. These are the kinds of podcasts wherein the show host will have a different guest for every episode. However, you can also have a drama type podcast wherein you have an actual script and you have voice actors who participate in the podcast. Some podcasts can also just be a conversation between multiple people, not just one or two. And if that's the case, then you might need to consider actually getting a co-host for your show. The next step is you need to work on your branding. You now have a rough idea of what your podcast is going to look like. Now, it's time to attach an actual name and image to your show. There are various resources online that can help you craft the ideal cover art for your show. I'm going to link them down below. But when it comes to names, there are typically three options that you have. The first and most obvious one is you can use your own real name. Next is you can use a kind of witty, punny, or clever name that will give listeners a better idea of what your show is actually about. For example, in our case, we're called the Fiction Friends. I have a co-host, she's my friend, and we talk about fiction books. And next, you can just use a standard descriptive name that actually tells people what your show is about. The next step is to create your intro. Ideally, you want your intro to be accompanied by some kind of backing music. For my podcast, I went with background music that's fun and approachable and lively because that's the kind of energy that I want my podcast to espouse. There are so many resources online that offer royalty-free music that you can use for your podcast. Granted, it can be really difficult if you're unwilling to shell out the cash for actually good music, but finding the perfect song for your intro will just make it all worth it. When it comes to scripting your intro, you want to say as much as possible while using as few words as possible as well. There are mainly three things that you need to focus on when you're talking about your intro: who you are, what your podcast is about, and why your listeners should listen to you. Your intro should last anywhere between 15 to 30 seconds is a good sweet spot. However, I've heard some intros that go for as long as a full minute. The next step is for you to plan your episodes. The ideal frequency of episode uploads can vary from podcast to podcast. For example, there are news podcasts that have daily uploads. Me personally, I do weekly uploads for my podcasts that spread out in multiple seasons. There are some podcasters that do episodes 3 times a week. Again, it's all dependent on the nature of of your podcast and how much you're actually willing to commit to your show. Just make sure that you're able to plan your episodes in such a way that it's sustainable. The next step is to develop episode scripts or outlines. Again, this can also vary depending on the nature of your podcast show. I don't really script my podcasts. However, I do have a general format or outline that I stick to consistently. And I always make sure to prepare for every episode by making notes. This is just to ensure that I don't end up forgetting to mention anything specific or important that I wanted to talk about. For the next step, you need to create your podcast studio. For this step, it can vary depending on what kind of budget you have. However, there are typically 3 pieces of equipment that you need in order to start a podcast. The first, of course, is a microphone. Second is a recording device. And third is an audio editing device. Of course, there are going to be more sophisticated podcast setups that have sound dampeners and acoustic panels. These are there to improve the overall sound quality, and if you have that kind of budget, then go for it. Other podcasts also have a video component, so they have lighting and video equipment as well. But typically, you only need a microphone, a recorder, and an audio editing device. In my personal opinion, the most important thing that you need to invest in is a good microphone. No amount of editing will be able to save or salvage terrible audio. You would also be saving yourself a lot of headaches as an editor if you invest in a good microphone right at the start. If you don't have a treated room with sound, acoustic panels, and whatnot, then it's best to stick with a dynamic microphone. Me personally, I have the Audio-Technica 2100X. It's the microphone that me and my partner use for all of our podcast episodes, and it's also the microphone that I use for my YouTube videos. So if you want a good idea of what the microphone sounds like, you're getting a good listen right now. If you're interested in a full review of the microphone, comment down below. I may be doing a review on it in the future. And if you want to buy the microphone for yourself, I'm going to link it down below. I recommend a dynamic microphone because it does a good job of isolating the voice of the speaker while blocking out environmental noise. This is opposed to a condenser microphone, which yes, captures more details in your voice, but it also has a tendency to capture the noises surrounding your room, like the fans and the air conditioning units and the dogs barking outside and whatever. For me, a condenser microphone is great only if you have an actual recording studio, but if you're working out of a room, then a dynamic microphone would serve you better. When it comes to an audio recording device, there are various options from brands like Zoom. However, I just use my laptop. Eventually, I might get something from Zoom or Rode, we'll see. But essentially, I just use my laptop for recording and editing all of my podcasts. The next step is to record your first episode. If you're recording the episode on your own, then make sure that you've prepared everything beforehand. If you have a guest or a co-host, then make sure that they've prepped for everything as well. During the recording process, everything should be smooth sailing, and that's why preparation is key. The next step is for you to edit your audio. No matter how good your content is, if your audio is bad, no one is going to listen to your podcast. You won't go too much into detail about how your podcast should sound. Again, the needs can vary depending on the nature of your show. However, I will link you down below to some of the references that I used in helping me for my own editing process. There are so many options for editing softwares out there. However, I would recommend Audacity. First of all, it's a free software. It's relatively easy to use. It's so easy to get into, and there's a reason why it's really popular amongst podcasters. Next, you need to choose a podcast hosting platform. Hosting platform is essentially a server where you can store all of your recorded podcasts. There are free and paid versions of hosting platforms online. Each of them offer a variety of different features and benefits. Some hosts offer in-platform editing features, others have better advertising options, others focus more on podcast communities. Again, it all depends on your personal needs and your wants. I'll put a list here of all the popular podcast host platforms. I personally use Red Circle because it's free. Again, it's easy to use. They don't have monetization yet in the Philippines. However, they are working with Stripe to bring monetization to Filipino podcasters, and that might be rolling out within the near future. The next step is to upload your podcasts and fill in your show notes. Show notes are important because they're what help the SEO for your podcast. Make sure that you're thorough with your show notes and that you give listeners a detailed description of what they can expect from your episodes. Of course, you also need to upload your cover art. You can just choose to use the standard cover art for your show for every episode. However, there are some podcast shows that have dedicated episode show cover art, and I think that that's the best practice. It's a great way to really set yourself apart from novice podcasters. However, this might not be practical for people who are uploading podcasts on a daily basis. Again, I'll include references down below on how you can write proper show notes. The next step is to actually distribute your podcasts. So merely putting your podcasts up on a podcast host server is not enough. You want to give listeners a chance to listen to your podcast on different platforms like Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and whatever. Most of the hosting platforms that I recommended earlier will make it really easy for you to distribute your podcast episodes to various other distribution channels. Now, the steps in distributing your episodes can vary from one host to another. Just make sure that you read the instructions of whatever hosting platform you're on. But for the most part, it should be a relatively easy and pain-free process. Next, you have to market your podcasts. Just because your podcasts are out there and they're ready for listening doesn't mean your job is done. This is especially true if you're just a beginner podcaster and you don't necessarily have a fan base yet. You have to make a conscious effort to market your podcast. The best way to do this would be to immerse yourself in other social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and whatever. I've personally found that posting in Facebook community groups are a great way to really push my content out there, especially in the bookworm clubs all over Facebook. However, I do also have TikTok content about books, and I use that as a platform to push my podcast too. Follow me on TikTok, it's @JetLuga10. Another way you can market your podcast is to get more established podcasters or celebrity guests to be on your show, or if you act as a guest on another person's show as well. And finally, the last step is, of course, to just keep on producing more episodes. More likely than not, your first episode is going to suck. That's normal. Over time, you're going to get better as a podcaster and your proficiency will grow with every single episode that you make. Podcasts are incredibly fun and they're so fulfilling. They've given me a lot of joy and I always look forward to creating new episodes. More than that, they've forced me to read more books than I've ever had in my entire life. The feedback that I've been getting from fans has been great and I really do appreciate it. It motivates me to keep on producing more episodes. So hopefully if you're a beginner podcaster, this video will have helped you in your process. And of course, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel. It really helps push my content to more people out there. This has been Jet. Thank you for listening and I'll see you around again soon.